For all of its futuristic space exploits, Star Wars is actually a spaghetti western through and through. Sure, they may have replaced pistols with laser blasters, but to their core they remain nearly identical. Star Wars is undeniably built upon the Western skeleton, only the meat on the bones don't take place in the Wild West. Instead, it's in outer space. Now, before you get too defensive, I'm only talking about the first 3 films in the series. After all, things sort of went off in their own direction and the original inspiration was lost.
Don't make me kill you.
At this point, Star Wars is just a regular action movie franchise with some sci-fi themes. It's a far cry from what it started out as, but it also looks like they're coming back to their roots in another way. The Mandalorian, the new series on Disney Plus, does a phenomenal job of taking Star Wars back to its original tone. It's gritty, it's dark, and it's undeniably a Western. The show is actually Star Wars at its purest. Now, before we jump into the new, let's examine the old. Star Wars was actually created as a melting pot of concepts. It takes space blasters and puts them in cowboy holsters. It takes samurai masters and sends them to elegant places. It wears it all, showing off its influences with pride. Apologies for the big book word, but it's pretty much the epitome of a postmodernist film. It took a bunch of stuff that already existed and made something new out of it. That could be pretty easy to overlook nowadays though. With every new entry into the constantly evolving Star Wars universe, it sort of just becomes a remake of itself. Now that the series is several decades old and has enough to draw from, it's mostly self-referential, and at this point is only elaborating on its own mythology. You see it all the time, they repeat the same in-jokes, they reference the same callbacks to events from the past, and they even hold up Darth Vader's mask as some sort of ancient artifact. It's almost become a remake of itself, or a reimagining if you will, which is a far cry from the heavily influenced origins it began as. Fan service is one thing, but when the majority of your content is just derivative from your old content, something ain't right. That's what makes The Mandalorian so refreshing. It's almost Star Wars the way Star Wars was intended to be. That's why fans have been so excited about it. The true diehard fans know their Star Wars, and they can all tell a cheaper model right away. That's why so many of the newer films, as well as the prequels, got such mixed reviews. Sure, it was Star Wars and it featured the same elements that they knew and loved, but they could also tell that something was just different. It's my belief that the missing element was the spaghetti western influence. Spaghetti western, for those who don't know, is a nickname for a large subgenre of western movies from the 1960s. Its origins are usually attributed to Sergio Leone. He's a notorious filmmaker of that era who had a unique style which led to international box office success. Most of these movies were produced and directed by Italians, so writers and critics started calling them spaghetti westerns. That's where the name came from. I know, kind of an underwhelming reason, but I'm just here to tell you the facts, guys, I'm sorry. These movies often had darker themes, and the characters were a bit more morally ambiguous when compared to your typical big screen heroes. The most famous example is probably The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, starring Clint Eastwood. It was the final film of the Dollars trilogy, which started with A Fistful of Dollars in 1966. The whole series is pretty much the epitome of what the genre is all about. It's meant to be edgy and fun. It's meant to be slower in pace, almost like a methodical pace. There's more suspense to the action, and we can really dive into a character's psyche. We even feel the tension of every moment because there's actual depth and value and it's not just all action. If you go back and rewatch The Empire Strikes Back, the same thing can be said. Of course, there are obvious fight scenes, but when they happen, they're drawn out. They tell a story. They aren't just action for the sake of a result. They're part of the drama. The outcome is unpredictable when there's so much tension. It's not like a battle in a Marvel movie where you're 99% sure that the good guy is going to come out on top. It's just a matter of how, usually. The spaghetti western and the original Star Wars films did a masterful job of creating that gray area. They actually tell the story of good versus evil, rather than simply just show how good wins. At the end of A Fistful of Dollars, the very first spaghetti western, Clint Eastwood can even be seen wearing a makeshift suit of armor that doesn't look too far off from The Mandalorian. That's how closely these two are linked. Side by side, you can see countless similarities between these styles of movies and the original Star Wars movies as well.
We need help.
We must buy guns. We know nothing about them.
Raiders.
We have money.
So you think I'm some kind of mercenary?
As the architect of the whole thing, George Lucas has even gone on record saying he was inspired by a famous Western by John Ford called The Searchers from 1956. The movie takes place in the desert of Monument Valley, which is not at all unlike Tatooine in Star Wars. According to Lucas, he, quote, saw the Western die, and he felt motivated to revive the genre only with a bit of a sci-fi twist. Now's as good a time as any to remind you to subscribe to ScreenRant and make sure that you turn on those notifications. If you're watching this on mobile, just go into your YouTube settings and click on Mobile Notifications. Now, back to the video. For example, let's look at the scene where Luke finds out about the passing of his aunt and uncle. It's an obvious reconstruction of a famous scene in The Searchers, where Martin comes home to find that his family has been taken out. Then Star Wars introduces the gunslinger Han Solo, who could not be more glaringly Western influenced. He even dresses like a cowboy, right down to the vest, the boots, and the holster on the hip. He's a loner and a questionable character, but has overtones of the good guy loner, like the Lone Ranger, if you will. And that Chewbacca is his Tonto. Even when Han Solo draws first and shoots Greedo under the table, there's a nearly identical scene in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Heck, Boba Fett's boots have spurs on them that you can hear when he walks around. Why would cowboy boots with spurs on them exist in the future in outer space? Lucas did a masterful job of taking something that people already knew and that they already liked and just repackaging it in a whole new way for you to enjoy again. There's a term in radio called stickiness that has to do with the familiarity of a song. Does it sound like another popular song? Will it make the audience feel like this is something that they've already heard before? If so, that's exactly what they're looking for. Radio stations want, quote, sticky songs because, for lack of a better term, if it ain't broke, don't break it. If a song that sounded kind of like this worked already in the past and is already registered in people's brains, then there's no reason why they wouldn't also enjoy this newer, updated version of the same song. That's literally the same formula that Star Wars was built upon. So what happened? How did we get to where we are today with this series if it started with pretty different intentions? Star Wars used to be a melting pot of genres and inspirations, but now it's essentially just your run-of-the-mill action movie. You've got your hero versus villain, and there's going to be a standard conflict and resolution, but the look and feel and pacing of it all just isn't the same. Well, for lack of a better explanation, the prequels happened. Years went by, and I guess the franchise kind of just got overconsumed by itself, to the point where it started making Star Wars movies inspired by older Star Wars movies, rather than make Star Wars movies inspired by something else. That's my largest issue with the sequels following that trilogy as well. Disney took over and just started cranking out as much content as they could. They're running a business after all. But that's what makes The Mandalorian so special. After all these years of losing focus and wandering off the path it set out on, finally things can feel back on track for the audiences who really care. Of course, we're still gonna see all the movies and roll our eyes at 50% of it, but The Mandalorian is the purest new Star Wars release in decades. The movies coming out now think that fan service is done through callbacks and references, but it isn't. Sure, we love our characters and our Star Wars history, and it's always fun to hop on the nostalgia bandwagon from time to time, but that's cheap fan service. Making content that's in line with the original intention of the series from way back in the 1970s, and using a similar style and tone and pacing to make it actually feel like what Star Wars is supposed to feel like, that's real fan service. From the way he enters a room to the way that he shoots right down to his subtle demeanor, everything about The Mandalorian is Western. Minus the whole cowboys in the Wild West part. Remove the entire Jedi versus Sith battle that we're always so used to, and it's the story of a lone bounty hunter trying his best to hold on to some form of a code within an outlaw land in the outer reaches of the galaxy. It's even written and executive produced by Jon Favreau, who's no stranger to the Western genre. He directed Cowboys and Aliens in 2011, and the pilot of the NBC show Revolution. Within the first few minutes of the series, the tone is set. We're invited into a shabby dive bar where two poachers are about to carve up a paying customer in plain sight. That's just the sort of thing that happens in this kind of outlaw territory. Before even delivering his first line, the Mandalorian starts smashing and lassoing and shooting. His very first line of dialogue is, quote, "I can bring you in hot or I can bring you in cold." Ugh, Clint Eastwood would be proud. So what do you guys think? Are you a fan of the old school style of Star Wars, or do you prefer the newer stuff? Let us know in the comments section down below what you think and why. Before you go, make sure you smash that thumbs up button, and if you haven't already, make sure that you're subscribed to ScreenRant to stay up to date on all of our latest releases. Until next time, bye!